hypertrophy's contribution or its importance for your performance is only going to increase with increased training duration. When to use higher frequencies, when not to use higher frequencies, at what cost does it make sense to use higher frequencies? I'm going to go through a few training variables, and I want you to rate them 1, 2, or 3. 1 being is not a primary focus, just don't screw it up.
Yep.
2 is be cognizant, but it's not like the primary thing driving the outcome, but like really don't mess that one up. 3 is this is literally what drives the stimulus, and this is what you should be prioritizing in terms of program design.
Okay.
Rest periods.
For strength?
For strength.
2.
Rest periods is a 2. Proximity to failure.
2.
I'm trying to think the order to go in here for effect. Volume.
What context? Are we talking about just peaking kind of situation?
You can give 2 answers, like one for long-term development and one for short-term strength expression.
For short-term strength expression, I'm going 2. For long-term, my bias would be like 2.5, maybe 3.
Long-term development.
Yeah.
Specificity of exercise selection.
I thought about this one. I
care about squat 1RM strength.
Yeah.
How important is it that I train squats versus other squatting patterns versus other just movements that train? So it's kind of like the specificity continuum of exercise selection. How important is it to be more specific?
Yeah, I'll say 2, but honestly, I think I'm more of a variability is probably okay kind of guy.
Give me an example of variability that's okay. Because there's a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
You could go squat or pause squat.
Yeah.
You could go bench or close grip bench. But how about pec flies?
I think I don't think that, like, to me, ultimately what you're trying to do is train the neuromuscular quality, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as long as the exercise achieves that, there's probably a place for it. So, like, do I think every single slot needs to be the competition movement? No. Do I think there can be pretty wide bounds on things, even if it's not totally mapping to specificity? Yeah. I think accommodating resistance has a place. I think very partial range of motion lifts have a place. I think overload stuff has a place. Like, I honestly think all that stuff can be effective for kind of a variety of reasons that kind of fit in my mental model of strength. Now, chest fly, I don't think you're trained, like, you probably can't do a 1RM, like, true force output in your muscles that are contributing to that movement due to the instability, due to the implement, due to the loadability. Like, there's just limitations associated with the exercise that don't allow you to do that. But I would say my net's probably wider than most people.
How about like the chest fly? So moving away from specificity in terms of exercise selection from a larger time scale.
Larger time scale. Oh, that one's tough. That one's really tough.
So you're saying specificity of exercise selection is a 2 in the short term, or did you say 3?
Yeah, I said 2. 2's kind of a cop-out answer. You should have given me hot or cold kind of deal. I think 2, because I think as long as you're training the neuromuscular quality, I think, and getting some exposure
in the short term.
Yeah, and getting some exposure. Long term, I think it's probably the same thing. Like, as long as you're getting some exposure to the task you're trying to improve, you're probably good. But then I think you need to be training the neuromuscular quality like quite a bit.
How about volume allocation? So volume allocation for the listener, while Zach comes up with his answer, is how much of your volume is on the specific movement that you care about. So for powerlifting, squat, bench, deadlift, we can also include very close variations like a tempo squat or pause squat or whatever, versus movements that are clearly targeted for muscular development. So something like a pec fly or a deficit push-up or a chest press or an RDL.
I might go 2.5 on that one. I kind of think that's probably one of the under thought on variables, I would say, just because I do think both directions of that probably have pretty meaningful short-term effects that can stack up over the long term. Yeah, I'll say 2.5 on that one maybe.
In the short term and the long term?
Yeah.
Okay.
But in opposite directions, kind of.
How about periodization? This is like an impossible one. Let's just say it's like good periodization.
So more so biasing.
And this would have to be a long-term only question.
I would say I'm pretty firmly in the camp of, if you're taking textbook definitions of periodization, I'm pretty firmly in the camp of concurrent periodization in the sense that you're essentially trying to target all qualities all the time that are relevant for your activity. So it's not concurrent in like a global sense. Like I'm not necessarily worried about the maximal aerobic capacity of a powerlifter, but insofar as the quality impacts that sport in some way, training those pretty much all the time. So in that case, periodization is like meh. But if you're talking about the exact proportions of those things over time, I would say that's maybe underrated, personally.
So 1, 2, or 3.
Oh, man.
We should have done a tier list.
Yeah.
S, A, B, D.
Yeah, maybe we could revisit this idea. I kind of like thinking through it this way. So periodization, I would say short to moderate term probably doesn't matter all that much, like 1.5. Long term, underrated, so I'd probably go like 2.5.
2.5.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're taking the 3-point scale and just turning it into 5. Super
Exactly.
cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Load.
3.
3?
Yeah.
In the short term?
Yeah.
How about in the long term?
The difficult thing with that one is I think that's probably the biggest pitfall of typical block periodization, and the reason people got away from that is that they weren't able to use the fancy periodization word, transmute their adaptations.
I thought it's
transmutate.
Transmutate, yeah.
Yeah, transmute's not a word.
I'm sure it's a word.
Transmutate. They weren't able to transmutate their adaptations from the lower load blocks into momentum, into their kind of their strength-oriented phases, because you were just so, foreign to the concept of those adaptations. So in the long run, I think people kind of get that now, though. So maybe I'll go 2 for a long run.
Okay.
So in terms of
load in the long term, what's your answer?
I think I said 2.
2.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All right. Frequency. Short term.
Short term, 2.5, 3 probably.
Okay. Long term.
2.
2.
2.
Dang, that's interesting. So kind of what I want to get at here is, to me, when we think about all the variables we just went through, and I'm sure I'll listen back to this and be like, why did I forget some obvious variable? I might be missing one. But frequency was kind of bumped up in the list for me, just a little bit. It didn't go from like a 1 to a 3 overnight, but it's like, oh, okay, this, like you said, this is probably an independent lever here.
Yeah, that's the key to me.
And to me, where I think it gets really interesting practically is like when to use higher frequencies, when not to use higher frequencies. At what cost does it make sense to use higher frequencies? Because there are obviously other things you need to consider when moving the chess pieces around the chessboard, because there were a lot of 2s in there, right? And strength, kind of to your point about the ecological validity or the ease of taking these outcomes and applying them directly to powerlifting training is tough, because we operate under the assumption that this is a little bit of a different game in the long term, because hypertrophy's contribution or its importance for your performance is only going to increase with increased training duration.
The thing I think that fundamentally separates strength from hypertrophy in this regard is that strength requires constraints to measure and compete in the task that are fixed across individuals that are not up for negotiation. I think that's the number one thing that changes things. Basic example. For hypertrophy, if a high bar squat gives you an awesome quad stimulus, great, you can use that. If you need a hack squat to do that due to your segment length or whatever, you can use that. And there's literally no restrictions. For strength, there are so many different variables that influence it, and ultimately you're still trying to fit a square peg in a round hole in terms of what you're competing with. And I think that just leads to so many different manifestations of the thing that you're ultimately trying to optimize for in terms of practical solutions, just based on, okay, if you get on board for a second just for the thought experiment that the quads are the primary limiter for the individual that I'm talking about to push their squat up, but their squat doesn't really train their quads super well when they use heavy loads, let's say, then some of these other variables that we're talking about, like maybe the frequency of squatting isn't going to help them in the long run. But the volume allocation maybe is really, really important to push it towards some of these other exercises. Like the fact that it's a constrained task that is the same across people who vary in, pretty fundamentally different ways, and particularly with respect to biomechanics, I think is what makes strength. There's a couple things that are kind of across the boards, and to me, I relate those to kind of the neuromuscular experience that is kind of irrelevant of the actual task. But when you apply that maximal strength assessment into a task, Now everything else needs to change to account for that. The fatigue associated with a set of squats based on your segment length is probably going to be way different. How much carryover is there between your squat and your deadlift? How are you performing those tasks to where the predominant limiter is in terms of the muscle group, and how does that interface on the rest of your training? Like, there's so many little things like this that are kind of impossible to contextualize that make the way that those other variables that don't really map to just like, again, like the neuromuscular task that you're trying to perform, I think that's what makes it considerably messier.